Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Chris Kenny. I'm joined now by the Shadow Education Minister, Christopher Pyne. Thanks for joining us.
Chris, good to see you.
We'll talk about some broader election issues in a moment, but I wanted to start off with education, especially given your dramatic backflip on Friday on the Gonski reforms, the so-called Gonski funding. Up until Friday, you were telling us that Gonski was Konski. So why have you signed up to a con?
Well, the truth is that the government is not introducing the Gonski report because that would require $6.5 billion of new spending every year, which over the next 4 years would be $26 billion. So it's true to say that the so-called Gonski model that Labor was introducing was a con, a smoke and mirrors trick.
But you've just signed up to it. You're saying you'll match whatever funding arrangements they strike, and they've now signed up Victoria and Queensland. I mean, they've won this debate hands down, and you're matching them.
No, not really, because what we said on Friday was that schools needed certainty in 2014. So there's absolutely no incentive for states like Victoria or Queensland now to hold out, because we've also said that we would dismantle all the central command and control features of the model from Canberra. So we'll dismantle the red tape and the bureaucracy.
That is
we'll
a
give them
change
the
that Kevin Rudd
money.
seems to have agreed to with Victoria and probably Queensland as well.
Well, I don't believe anything Kevin Rudd says, and I can't imagine anybody else would. But now that the states know that the coalition, if we win, will give them the same amount of money without the central command and control features, with less red tape and bureaucracy, I think they're pretty comfortable to go ahead with that certainty.
But you've been running around the country criticising this deal for years, calling it a con, saying that in some states funding would actually go backwards. I mean, you must have got dizzy with this backflip. When did you first find out that Tony Abbott was going to do this backflip and you had to go along with it?
Well, I'm the Shadow Minister for Education, Chris, and I've been driving this policy agenda for the entire 4.5 years that I've been in the job.
So you decided to agree with Labor?
I decided that it was important that schools have certainty in 2014. Labor's created an absolute mess over the last 6 months. They had 4 jurisdictions in, 4 jurisdictions out. They had a $325 million cut over the next 4 years, but with all these side deals and secret arrangements, we have no idea what the amount of money is that they're now spending. But it's not fair on schools or their parents or the principals to not know what their funding model is going to be next year. So we've said that we'll give them complete certainty. There isn't cigarette paper between us and the Labor Party on the funding.
You and Labor are the same on education.
We're absolutely the same on education, except we'll remove the central command and control.
So over the next 4 years, over the forward estimates, what will it cost?
Well, until we see the PFO, we don't know what these secret deals mean. We know
So you've signed up to a funding agreement and you don't even know how much it will cost?
Well, we know that our funding envelope will be exactly the same as Labor's. So if you vote Liberal or you vote Labor, you'll get exactly the same funding envelope.
Aren't you sounding a bit like Bill Shorten when he said he agreed with the Prime Minister no matter what it is? You're saying you'll agree to Labor's education funding no matter what it is?
I'm saying that schools need the certainty and states need the certainty to know that whether they vote Liberal or Labor, they'll get exactly the same amount of money.
So we don't really know whether we can afford this. I mean, my inclination in this area is that Labor is making grand promises a long way out and we don't really know about their affordability given we're running budget deficits, and now the opposition are just signing up to that for political purposes at whatever cost it is to the economy.
Well, we know over the next 4 years it was a cut of $325 million, but they've offered $603 million to the Catholics, $150 million to the Independent Schools Council of Australia, extra money to the Tasmanians and the South Australians and the New South Welsh. We don't know what the secret deal is with Victoria or Queensland, or they offered $600 million to Western Australia. So we know that it's no longer a cut, but we have to see PFO to know exactly what the new amount of money is. But we're happy to match that funding envelope in order to give schools, parents and school councils certainty.
Yeah, well, you know, it worries me because if there's economic irresponsibility in this funding package, we've got neither side of politics is going to pick it. We're just agreeing to spend it regardless. But I need to move on to the general election campaign here. You've obviously just said that you don't trust Kevin Rudd on anything he says. You've been hypercritical of this government. Then you'd be expecting to march on to election victory then?
Well, we hope that the Australian public will see that on the one side of the ledger there is a stable, certain opposition that's had the same leader for 4 years, roughly the same front bench for 4 years. We have the policies in place in the R Plan document to try and stabilise Australia, to restore confidence to economic management, to try and stop the job anxiety that people have, reduce the cost of living by abolishing the carbon tax and the mining tax, and of course we have a plan to stop the boats and to protect our borders after Kevin Rudd opened our borders again in 2008. On the other side we have the frantic, chaotic, dysfunctional Labor Party, which has had, in my portfolio, 4 higher education ministers in 4 months, 6 small business ministers in 6 years, 3 prime ministers in 6 years.
Yeah, there's been amazing turnover, and there's been 4 immigration ministers, and of course they've never delivered a budget surplus. In fact, they've promised surpluses and delivered deficits. We've had 1,100 deaths at sea with the borders reopening. They promised not to introduce a carbon tax, and they brought one in.
You've got all the lines down pat.
Yet you're 50-50 in the polls. What does this say about the opposition when you have so many government failures, yet the opposition seem to be scratching to get ahead?
Well, that hasn't been the case, of course, since in the last 3 years.
It is now, since the return of Kevin Rudd
has led in every poll in the last 3 years, and Labor is yet to pull ahead in any poll. But of course you'd expect Kevin Rudd to be having a honeymoon period. He's the shiny new toy of Australian politics.
He's not the new toy. He's the man people elected in 2007. Why has he made it so competitive when, as you say, there is a litany of failures that you could be pointing to and should be pointing to win over the Australian public?
Well, you and I have been observing elections for a long time. Well over 20 years. When a leader changes, there's always a honeymoon period, and Kevin Rudd's been having his honeymoon period, but I think that is about to fall off the cliff. I've been out supermarketing in the last few weeks in my electorate. A few weeks ago he was a lot more popular than he was yesterday when I was out supermarketing, and that's why, of course, he's called an election, because the faceless men have said you have to get off to the polls as soon as you can. He wanted to go, Kevin 747, to St Petersburg and to New York and do all that. But of course, winning an election from opposition is like climbing Mount Everest. It's not easy.
So Tony Abbott says,
we don't change government very often.
You were sounding rather confident there a moment ago.
I am very confident that I have great faith in the Australian public, that they will not want to wake up the day after the election and have re-elected this dysfunctional, chaotic, divided government that's given them cost of living pressures, job anxiety, 50,000 new boat arrivals and 8 deficit budgets on the trot, one after the other.
Now, we began by talking about the funding for Gonski, and of course we had the economic statement from the government on Friday. A lot of economic bad news in there, including tax increases to pay for it and the like.
3 taxes in 5 weeks.
We need to see from the opposition, you're confronting the same budget pressures. We need to see the detailed costings from the opposition. When can we expect to see them, and how accurate can they be, given sorts of open-ended promises we've heard on Gonski?
Well, the problem with the Labor Party's figures, the numbers that the Labor Party keeps announcing, is they change from month to month. 2 months ago, Penny Wong said that the numbers in the budget were irrefutable and set in stone, and then, of course, last Friday she said, well, you know, I might have said that 2 months ago, but we just change our figures like we change our outfits or our suits. It's very hard to rely on the government's numbers.
But you will put all your numbers into the Parliamentary Budget Office, which of course is independent of government, and will verify all of that?
Well, as you pointed out, last Friday the government issued their apologia for their hopeless economic management over the last 6 years. We've got 3 taxes in 5 weeks, 4,000 boat arrivals in the last 4 weeks since Kevin Rudd's been the Prime Minister, $3 billion a week they were spending above what they'd expected in the budget. So we've now got a $30 billion deficit this financial year. They've given us the most accelerated debt figures in any government since Federation. So no one's raised more debt as quickly as the Rudd government has.
So the time should be right for some honesty for the public. And will the opposition will the coalition detail serious cuts, substantial cuts to government expenditure which are required, or are we going to see the same old routine where if you form government you have a commission of audit and then you outline a whole lot of drastic measures?
Well, I'm very confident that Tony Abbott will not promise anything that he can't deliver, and he won't do anything that he doesn't promise. So I think the Australian public will have a very clear choice by election day between an opposition that's telling them exactly what we'll do and a government led by Kevin Rudd, which, let's not forget, in 2007 he said he'd fix the DFRDB pensions for the veterans, abolish it in 2008. Last Thursday he announced he'd fix it again. Of course, he won't do that in 2014. This is a guy who said he wanted to level with the Australian people in his rather surprising press conference this afternoon. He wanted to level with the Australian people. He said 6 weeks ago he couldn't see any circumstances out of any kind in which he could be Prime Minister again, and yet he's running for election as Prime Minister.
He's certainly Prime Minister again, and he's changed the game. Just speaking of unusual press conferences, just before we go, Tony Abbott says he's fair dinkum. What do you understand by that expression? What does that say about what he's trying to say?
I think what he says is what you see with me is what you get. Whereas with Kevin Rudd, of course, we don't see that. So in 2007, he said he was a conservative economist. We discovered after that he used to describe himself as a Christian socialist. He spent $254 billion more
Tony Abbott was speaking
than he's
about
raised.
himself. Tony Abbott says he's fair dinkum.
That's right, because
so
he is fair dinkum.
It's about contrasting with Kevin Rudd.
Well, what you see with Tony Abbott is what you get. With Kevin Rudd, you never know. He says he's changed, but a leopard never changes his spots, and the Australian public are not stupid.
Christopher Pyne, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.
I'll be back after the break with a fantastic panel, and don't forget, a little taste of what Newspoll has in store for the political situation in tomorrow's Australian.